In the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a message was revealed to Daniel, whose name was called Belteshazzar. The message was true, but the appointed time was long, and he understood the message and had understanding of the vision. In those days, I, Daniel, was mourning 3 full weeks. I ate no pleasant food, no meat nor wine came into my mouth, nor did I anoint myself at all, till 3 whole weeks were fulfilled. Now on the 24th day of the 1st month, as I was by the side of the great river, that is, the Tigris, I lifted my eyes and looked, and behold, a certain man, clothed in linen, whose waist was girded with gold of Uphaz. His body was like beryl, his face like the appearance of lightning, his eyes like the torches of fire, his arms and his feet like burnished bronze in color, and the sound of his words like the voice of a multitude. And I, Daniel, alone saw the vision, for the men who were with me did not see the vision, but a great terror fell upon them, so that they fled to hide themselves. Therefore I was left alone when I saw this great vision, and no strength remained in me, for my vigor was turned to frailty in me, and I retained no strength. Yet I heard the sound of his words, and while I heard the sound of his words, I was in a deep sleep on my face, with my face to the ground. Suddenly, a hand touched me, which made me tremble on my knees and on the palms of my hands. And he said to me, O Daniel, man greatly beloved, understand the words that I speak to you and stand upright, for I have now been sent to you. While he was speaking this word to me, I stood, trembling. Then he said to me, do not fear, Daniel, for from the first day that you set your heart to understand and to humble yourself before your God, your words were heard, and I have come because of your words. But the prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days, and behold, Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, for I had been left alone there with the kings of Persia. Now I have come to make you understand what will happen to your people in the latter days, for the vision refers to many days yet to come. When he'd spoken such words to me, I turned my face toward the ground and became speechless. Suddenly, one having the likeness of the sons of men touched my lips. Then I opened my mouth and spoke, saying to him who stood before me, my Lord, because of the vision, my sorrows have overwhelmed me, and I have retained no strength. For how can this servant of my Lord talk with you, my Lord? As for me, no strength remains in me now, nor is there any breath left in me. Then again, the one having the likeness of a man touched me and strengthened me, and he said, O man greatly beloved, fear not. Peace be to you. Be strong. Yes, be strong. So when he spoke to me, I was strengthened and said, let my Lord speak, for you have strengthened me. Then he said, do you know why I have come to you? Now I must return to fight with the prince of Persia. When I've gone forth, indeed, the prince of Greece will come. But I will tell you what is noted in the scripture of truth. No one upholds me against these except Michael, your prince. Also in the first year of Darius the Mede, I stood up to confirm and strengthen him. But now I will tell you the truth. So on. We're coming almost to the close of our studies in this remarkable book. And there's one vision yet to speak of. It's really given to us in chapter 11 of Daniel, but it has a preface and it has a postscript. Chapter 10 is the preface to the last vision that Daniel received. Chapter 12 is the postscript to it. So tonight we'll say something about the preface, chapter 10, and next week, God willing, we'll finish up by looking at the final vision together with its postscript in chapter 12. I want to mention to you 4 points arising out of chapter 10, each of them relating to Daniel's faithfulness. it's the picture of the man. It's a constancy about him, isn't there? I don't know whether I mentioned that at the beginning of the thing, but I think it was when we were in the hall earlier on, that one of the things that was said about Queen Elizabeth II was that she was constant. There was a constancy about her, and it's certainly true of Daniel. So it's a great characteristic that you're not up one day and down the next. You're not roller coaster sort of a person. Daniel was like that. There's this constancy of faithfulness throughout his life. So we'll pick up 4 issues of his faithfulness. The first, I was going to say it's associated, I think, and I might be wrong with this, but I think it's associated with considerable degree of misunderstanding today. We don't hold a course with what people call the prosperity gospel, believe God and everything will be hunky-dory. That's a complete nonsense and it's so unbiblical. But I think nevertheless, even in those of us who point out the error of such a doctrine, we kind of feel in our subconscious that if we remain faithful, then everything will turn out fine. Well, let's have a look at that as it comes out to us out of chapter 10 of Daniel. We've said several times before that Daniel, throughout his book, teaches us how to behave when we're in a hostile environment. Now, I know that a lot of Daniel's experience didn't appear to be hostile on the surface, but nevertheless they were. This was a Jew. He was a prince of Judah. And to him, it was no easy thing to live in Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar, under the Babylonians or the Medes and Persians. And he knew persecution. He knew difficulty. He also knew great honor and great favor. But the thing with Daniel is that he remained, as I said again, constant through it all. His faithfulness didn't give in to that. The thing is that hostility is not always what it appears to be. It can sometimes be something under the surface. And it is true of you and I that we live in a hostile environment. It doesn't seem like that in the UK. We're not living in Myanmar or Afghanistan, some of these places. North Korea, imagine, trying to do what we do in those countries. So there's a great deal of ease about the way we live our lives. But this is the misunderstanding. It's still hostile. The world is opposed to us, and that's to put it mildly. James says, it's James 4:4, he says it's enmity. Heavy word. It's enmity. So that's the difference between the world and its ways, its measurements, its valuations, and all of those things, and what you and I have been given. They are diametrically opposed. And the danger of the kind of culture that we live in the West generally is that the world appears to be so friendly that we forget that we're actually in a hostile environment. I'll give you an example of that outside of the book of Daniel. Numbers chapters 22 to 25 record a signal incident in the experience of Israel. 22, that they're on the cusp of entering into the land. They're soon to, Moses is about to leave. They're about to go over the Jordan and into the land of promise. And they make their final encampment on the east of the Jordan in the plains of Moab. Acacia Grove. Sounds like a road out of Surbiton, doesn't it? But that's what it was called, Acacia Grove. There they made their encampment. And 23 and 24 in Numbers is God giving, through a very remarkable subject. I won't go into it because it's not our subject, but God gives his perspective on what he thought about his people. And one of many things that comes out in that he talks about their peculiar separateness. They're mine, they're different to every other nation on earth. There's a distinctive difference between this people that are camped down there and all the other nations. Well, that's fine. But then you go over into chapter 25, and that's the sequel, and it's a very sad sequel, because seemingly the people of Israel were oblivious and cared little for the divine perspective of their separateness, and they joined themselves with Moab. Actually, the word in verse 3 of Numbers 25 is they joined themselves to Baal. So it was harlotry, it was adultery, both physical and spiritual. And that's what happened down there. And 24,000 people died in a plague because of it. The consequences were severe. There was no light matter. And it happened because people forgot that they were in an hostile environment. Moab came with a very friendly outstretched arm, and all seemed very hunky-dory with Moab. It was disastrous, absolutely disastrous. And so it will be today. You make the equivalent link, I know, with our own time and so on. The point about Daniel is that he got that right. He recognized the friendly outstretched arm of his was to be regarded with great caution, whether it was Darius or whoever it was that was doing it. And he was careful with that. And he maintained his perspective on the things that mattered most. So Daniel is a good example. He's faithful in a hostile environment. Now, we've not come to the point yet that I'm wanting to bring to this first point, because it's really that faithfulness is sometimes accompanied by distress. And that's what we find in chapter 10. How could that be? Daniel didn't deserve that, did he? He didn't deserve to be distressed. And it's not the first time we find him in this condition either, is it? I don't think we've commented on it before, so we'll do it tonight. Daniel is in deep distress because there's an inevitability about living in hostile circumstances that will bring stress and distress. And we better face that. We better take it on board. Because if we don't, we're in denial of something that's clearly taught for us in the scriptures. We're not really to make ourselves that much at home in this world. And we are to accept that at times we will be greatly distressed. Pardon me, Lawrence, for the personal note, but you mentioned in your prayer, it really troubles us. I think that was your word. That's what I'm talking about. There are things that really trouble us, and they ought to. And we look at the kind of things you were referring to as you led us in prayer and other matters, and we're distressed. Let's work out how that actually worked out in the Bibles, case here in chapter 10 at least. The message that he received, verse 1, that's what distressed him. Now, I have to say to you, I'm not sure what that is a reference to. It may include at least some of the visions that he'd already received. But the date is very interesting. In the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia. Now that places it at around about 535 or 534 BC. And if you carefully correlate your reading in Ezra with Daniel's experiences, you'll find that in the 1st year of Cyrus, that's not the 1st year that Cyrus was king, by the way, it's the 1st year that Cyrus' reign, a Gentile ruler, reference to people of God. We talked about that before. So in what's called the 1st year of Cyrus' reign, Cyrus made a proclamation. You can go back and build your temple. Huge, massive thing that happened. And Daniel, of course, was rejoicing in all of that. He'd read Jeremiah's scroll and thought, this is going to happen. And sure enough, it was happening. He'd seen them go. 538, round about there, 38, 37, they went. You come to 536, and they've set the altar up, and they've re-established the offerings down there in Jerusalem. And the spring of 535, they've started laying the foundations for the temple. And then it went wrong. And they ceased. They didn't do any more building. 15 years ran by until God sent Haggai, his prophet, to speak to them. And then the building of the temple resumed. Now, that's in the time frame of the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia. That's how we open the thing. So is it not probable that part of the message on the news that reached Daniel's ears was the condition of things in Judah? Having rejoiced at Jeremiah's prophecy being fulfilled, now he's hearing back of things going wrong and being things stagnating and buildings ceased and so on. And he's feeling this great, remember what he's been told about the spiritual forces against him and against the people of God, against God. And he's putting all this together. And he sets himself 3 weeks, 3 whole weeks. He's not partial, it's 3 whole weeks. And he had no wine nor meat, nor anointed himself. I don't even know what some of the details mean, the last one anyway. But here's and are we not to suppose, as we'll come to this in a minute, that he fasted in that. But sorry, let's go back to this book, so we'll come to that in a minute, his fasting and prayer. The word that Daniel heard back east wasn't the best news, that's the point. And that mattered a great deal to him. That was at least part of his distress. This is the point. Faithfulness sometimes involves distress. We better expect it, because it happened in Daniel's case. It happened in the Apostle Paul's case. So that's Old Testament, New Testament. We better not be surprised that it happens in our case too. Paul says that his concern for the churches weighed on him daily. It's a huge weight with this grand apostle. So we're saying here that faithfulness is no picnic. We mustn't equate faithfulness to life becoming all sunny. It's not like that. It's not a bed of roses. It carries with it certain pressures that will sometimes strain at our innermost being and cause distress. So we face up to it. But we've been prepared for that, and that's the point. We have access to resources that enable us to cope and to overcome and to keep going, so that faithfulness, despite all that opposes it, does not succumb to pressures to destroy it. Keep your faithfulness, even in the face of distress. The Lord Jesus said, in the world you will have tribulation. Doesn't get any clearer than that, does it? John 16:31. In the world you will have tribulation, and your heart plummets. And then you hear him say, oh, by the way, I've overcome the world. And you lift up. It's all right. It's okay to be distressed. We ought to be, because of things that you've mentioned and because of the news of things. The fellowship is in trouble, by the way, in the West. The fellowship's growing, but not in the West. We're shrinking in the West. We rejoice in what's happening on the great continent of Africa. India is growing. Philippines is growing. But in the West and other places, we're shrinking. That ought to distress us. It's the concern that Paul had, the concern that Daniel had of the people. Now, a second point is not dissimilar in some ways, is that it runs contrary to many people's thinking of how Christianity works today. But it's this, that faithfulness is accompanied by fear. That's surely a contradiction. If we're going to be faithful, we don't need to fear. We need to qualify what we mean by fear, of course. And in this context, it's a proper realization of powers that are far greater than anything that we encounter in our everyday life. It's holding a proper recognition and a humility of spirit before spiritual forces. I put that to you because it stands out here in chapter 10 of Daniel, and it's stark. We're looking here at Daniel's attitude before the being that he encounters standing by the river Tigris. Now, I'm sorry if you're looking to me for an answer as to who this was. I can't give it to you. Maybe you feel more sure about this than I do, but I simply do not know. There's a good, well-made case for it being a Christophany. That's an appearance of Christ pre-incarnation. And there are several of those in the Old Testament. Whether this is one of them or not is open to question. The reason we think that is because of the description. It seems to fit so closely to what John saw on the Isle of Patmos, Revelation chapter 1. We know that. The other theory is that it was an angel. If it helps, and I don't suspect it will, but if it helps at all, my own personal leaning is towards the latter. I have difficulty with the first because of verse 13 and this person needing the help of Michael. However, perhaps we'll discuss that on another occasion. The point for tonight is it doesn't matter it's Daniel's attitude before this being that I'm wanting to make a point to you. Faithfulness, faithful Daniel, his faithfulness was accompanied by fear of a particular kind. We're approaching, let's, if you don't mind just running with me for the moment, let's assume, and I know that we need to be careful with this, let's assume this is an angel and not the Lord. We're approaching a time of the year when we'll no doubt have to endure looking at depictions of angelic beings that are as ridiculous as they are insulting. I don't know wherever in the world the idea of cherubs being like chubby children ever came from, but it didn't come from this book. And you read Genesis and you read Ezekiel, read the early chapters of Genesis, and the responsibility that the cherubim is the Hebrew plural word for cherubs. You read about them in the book of Ezekiel, and you wonder. I know the world of art hasn't helped at all, whether it's ancient classical art or any medieval or Renaissance or Romanticism or whatever other kind of art there is up to modern art. None of it's helped. Over centuries, angels have been depicted in a very inaccurate and I say quite insulting way. And what you've got here in Daniel chapter 10 is a picture of somebody who is a terrifying, intimidating warrior. He's an angel. If it's not the Lord, this is an angel. And angels are often portrayed like that. So is the Lord, by the way. And Daniel knew what it was to bow down before such a person. Not in, if he wasn't bowing down in worship, of course, that's another issue. But to feel his weakness and dread, to fear in the. And I mentioned this point because we live in an age, saying it's true of us, of course, but we live in an age, we're surrounded by people whose view of such things is by all means careless and is arrogant. We get very careless with the idea of spiritual forces that are much more powerful than us and make jokes about them. It's not helped, of course, by children's television. And with getting very young children used to the idea of such things, forces, being a bit of a joke. And you know, Satan wants us to think of him as being a bit of a joke, because then we'll never realize that we should be in fear of spiritual forces. I read once of a man who was wanting to speak with John MacArthur after a meeting somewhere. And he said to him, Dr. MacArthur, he said, I've seen the Lord several times. In fact, I've had several visions of him. He comes and talks with me. In fact, he gave an example of it. He said, he talks to me while I shave in the morning. And John MacArthur said to him, I have just one question. Do you stop shaving? What he was really asking the man was, does this appearance of the Lord, spiritual forces that are so far above you, you've not even begun to understand them, does this encounter interrupt your everyday way of life? Of course, that's a very penetrating question. Do you stop shaving? Because that's the issue. And no doubt you've met men and women, different people who've said the same thing I have. And I'm not dismissing them, by the way. It's quite difficult actually to invalidate such claims, I find. But what I'm saying is that I feel very strongly when somebody seeks to justify frivolous things when it comes to spiritual beings that are far, far greater than you and me. We don't make a joke about angels. Very, very careful how we speak of such things. And that's not even getting near to what we feel as regards the Lord himself, of course. I remember seeing a TV program years ago in which an arrogant young man stood before a judge who was giving his sort of summary of the case. And he interrupted himself as he was speaking. He said, and get your hands out of your pockets. And then he carried on. The fellow was just standing there with his hands in his pocket. You know, there are situations where a laissez-faire attitude is utterly inappropriate. And we ought to recognize that. Happens in divine service, of course, but here we're talking about his attitude towards you. So faithfulness is accompanied by a proper sense of fear. It's akin to awe. In a world of arrogance and pride, in the face of glories that far surpass us, we do well to mark Daniel's example. I made a reference here, you might want to just jot it down, look at it for yourself. Jude, little epistle of Jude, verses 8 to 11. He speaks about those who mock, ridicule, revile dignitaries. And you note there what he says about it. It's worth reading. Now, the third point, and this is where we come to, is prayer. And I'm saying prayer. Prayer is not mentioned here, but surely we are to understand that during these 3 weeks of fasting and so on, that incorporated prayer. Daniel, as we often sing, was a man of prayer. So 3 times he prayed there. Must have been incorporated into this. So, of course, we've become used to thinking of faithfulness and prayer. In the case of Daniel, last week we spent a good deal of time on his model prayer we find in chapter 9. What we want to do now out of chapter 10 is simply point out the wonder of the power of prayer. Have a look at verse 12. This is the angel now speaking to him. And he says, "Do not fear, Daniel, for from the first day that you set your heart to understand, to humble his heart before your God, your words were heard. And I have come because of your words." What is that? That's an angel mobilized because of a man's words. What is the power of prayer? I sometimes think I've hardly begun to tap into it. This is immense. Prayer mobilizes angels. We put it starkly as that. That's the power of prayer. And maybe we just leave the matter there. The final point has to do with faithfulness being associated with spiritual warfare. And of course, we're going to open this up more next week when we get into the vision itself. This is the preface, as we say, to the vision. I don't know whether it's still the case. I'm not so aware of it these days. I suppose so much is done on the internet, but there was a day when, not long ago, when if you walked into a Christian bookshop, the amount of available shelf space was seen to be sort of unevenly divided, and there'd be a whacking great lot of it given over to books on spiritual warfare. Apparently, there's no end of would-be authors who want to write on the subject. And unfortunately, a lot of them have not helped at all, giving us a very good understanding of the scriptural perspective on spiritual warfare, of which there's a lot, of course, in the scriptures. What do we learn then from Daniel 10 about it? That there are spiritual, evil, angelic, and I'm using the word in the sense of fallen angels, so we could say demonic, powers that are specifically linked to world rule. In this case, Persia and Greece. And we're going to see more of that next week. I don't know if any of you were at the study day in Birmingham last year. Brian Johnson did. Yeah? And you remember Brian's presentation on principalities and powers?
Yes.
Very, very insightful. Well, that's what we're touching on here with Daniel 10. So hence the mention of Persia and Greece. There are battles fought and being fought between evil forces and angelic forces of a heavenly kind, involving, for instance, the Archangel Michael here. He's brought into it. This is the kind of text that we're in danger of, two dangers. One is of sensationalizing it, of getting our imaginations, and that's the trouble, children's TV thing again, you know, of going, well, it's not just children, it's, be careful with J.R. Tolkien. And I loved his books. I confess I still do, actually. But you know, the evil forces. So be careful with your imagination. Stick to scripture to get an accurate picture of spiritual warfare. It hasn't really to do with Middle Earth. It has to do with something that the scriptures tell us about. So these battles are going on. The archangel Michael himself is involved in the thing. So it's massive. We mustn't sensationalize it, but neither must we trivialize it and act as if we don't know about it. We've been told about it. So we're to think about spiritual warfare. Let's try and find it in this final point, this safe place between over-imagination and trivialization. Where's the safe place in between the chapter 10? Does a text like this in chapter 10 not teach us that there are spiritual forces abroad that are set on inflicting harm and havoc on the people of God? That's what was happening here, through Persia, through Greece, right at the very hub of it, were God's covenanted people. It's always been the case through all of human history. If God sets his affection on a thing, his purpose on a thing, the forces of evil will be gathered against it. Powers of darkness all around it, trying to put out the light. Some of that is seen, of course, in earthly incidents and circumstances. If I mentioned Afghanistan to you right now as we sit here, that's one example of where those powers of darkness are seen to be against those who belong to God, his children, in that case in Afghanistan. And when you see it that way, it's not a surprising thing and neither is it a sensational thing to say that the powers of darkness will be very, very active and involved in Bali right now, because these are world leaders that are there, and these are powerful spiritual forces that are seeking to influence the politicking of men. And apparently it goes on like that. And that's what Daniel 10 teaches us. But here's the point out of that. How does it make you feel? What does it do to your psyche, to your spirit? It could make us fearful. It could actually disturb us deep down within ourselves to know that this kind of thing goes on. But this chapter does not leave us in such a condition. Whatever it did to Daniel, the man who was lying on his face and then on his hands and the palms of his hands and his knees, then got to stand up. And the strength of God was given to him. God strengthened him to stand. And that's surely what you and I have to know in the face of spiritual warfare. Don't ignore it. Don't over-sensationalize it. Stick with what the scriptures say. But that's surely enough for us. These are terrifying, terrifying realities that are going on in that spiritual sphere right now. As we sit here, it's happening. Warfare, spiritual warfare. And it's aimed at taking you and I out. We're in the hell islands. And what are you to do with that? Fearful? Deeply disturbed? No, you're to feel God lifting you up, putting you on your feet and saying, stand. Can I just read have a look at Psalm 124. I'm just done here, I'm sorry. Psalm 124, because this to me is a good example. I was reading this earlier. It seems to me to cut through this over-sensationalizing or trivializing. Psalm 124. Just follow this through with me, bearing in mind what we've just said about spiritual warfare. Because we can read Psalm 124, say, oh yeah, David, chased from pillar to post by Saul and so on. It was hard going. Now read it in the light of what you and I know is happening right now. If it had not been that the Lord was who was on our side, let Israel now say, if it had not been the Lord who was on our side when men rose up against us, then they would have swallowed us alive. When their wrath was kindled against us, then the waters would have overwhelmed us. The stream would have gone over our soul. Then the swollen waters would have gone over our soul. Blessed be the Lord, who has not given us as prey to their teeth. Our soul has escaped as a bird from the snare of the fowler. The snare is broken, and we have escaped. Our help is in the name of the Lord, who made heaven and earth. Isn't that good? That's how you face spiritual warfare. Not by little incantations and mantras, by the way. Some of the charismatic dear people keep telling us it's not that. It's just by simple faithfulness. Faithfulness engages with spiritual warfare. Why do you think God's told us about this? Did we have to know? I came across this. This is Calvin, and I couldn't put it better than this. This is what Calvin did. We've been forewarned that an enemy relentlessly threatens us. An enemy who is the very embodiment of rash boldness, of military prowess, of crafty wiles, of untiring zeal and haste, of every conceivable weapon, and of skill in the science of warfare. We're in trouble. Then he says, we must then bend every effort to this goal. Let us not be overwhelmed by carelessness or faint-heartedness, but with courage rekindled, let us stand our ground in combat. And I'll give you one more thing, because some years ago at Buxton, we had a conference, and we sang a hymn. It's not in our hymn book, and it's Martin Luther's great "A Mighty Fortress is Our God." Remember? Yes. Let me read you this. A mighty. This is translated from German, of course, but it comes off pretty good in English. Some of the rhyming words perhaps strain a tad, but it's pretty good. A mighty fortress is our God, a bulwark never failing. Our helper he, amid the flood of mortal ills prevailing. For still our ancient foe does seek to work us woe. His craft and power are great, and armed with cruel hate. On earth is not his equal. That's us, being fearful before the terror of spiritual forces that are above us. Did we in our own strength confide, our striving would be losing. Were not the right man on our side, the man of God's own choosing. You ask who that may be? Christ Jesus, it is he. Lord Sabaoth his name, from age to age the same, and he must win the battle. And though this world with devils filled should threaten to undo us, we will not fear, for God has willed his truth to triumph through us. The prince of darkness grim, we tremble not for him. His rage we can endure, for lo, his doom is sure. One little word shall fell him. That word above all earthly powers, no thanks to them abideth. The spirit and the gifts are ours, through him who with us sideth. Let goods and kindred go, this mortal life also. The body they may kill. God's truth abideth still. His kingdom is forever. Isn't that good? Good old Martin Luther. He caught, I think, the strain of what Daniel came through in chapter 10. And standing on his feet, he was then given the vision. We'll have a look at that next week.